The back of my wrist still smelled like dish soap and cheap lemon sanitizer when I checked my phone in the staff hallway and saw the number that mattered more than my pride. $24. Not $24 left for the week. Not $24 in the rainy day envelope I never managed to build. $24 total. Sitting in my checking account like a joke the universe kept telling me because it knew I was too tired to laugh. I was Claire Dawson, and if there was one thing I'd become good at since Ethan died, it was stretching impossible math until it looked like survival. Rent first, heat second, because Boston didn't care about my feelings. Groceries after that, if the heat company didn't cut me off. Hazel's school forms, the field trip fee, the sneakers she'd grown out of in what felt like a single week. Those lived in the spaces between, the places I tried to fill with extra shifts and wishful thinking. The babysitter text came in at 2:15 p.m., right as I was pinning my hair into the tight bun the hotel required. My brain didn't even process the words at first. I just felt the blood drain from my face and the cold sweat gather under my uniform collar. It wasn't a long message. It didn't need to be. Something about an emergency. Something about not making it. Something about being sorry. Sorry was a word I heard a lot. Sorry your husband is gone. Sorry the landlord raised the rent. Sorry the school can't waive the fee again. Sorry we can't hold your spot if you can't pay by Friday. I stood there in the narrow staff corridor with the beige walls and the flickering fluorescent lights, and realized I had exactly two choices. Call out and lose the shift I needed to keep the lights on, or bring my 7-year-old daughter into a black tie gala and pray nobody noticed. People like me didn't get to choose the safe option. We chose the option that kept us breathing. By 3:10 p.m., Hazel was sitting on the edge of our couch in her little puffer coat, her copper-brown hair in 2 braids, staring at me like she already knew I was about to ask her to do something unfair. I told myself I was going to make it sound like an adventure. I told myself I wasn't going to let my fear leak into her. But the truth was, fear had been living in me so long it didn't need permission anymore. I explained it the way I always did when I had to pull Hazel into the adult version of survival. I framed it as temporary. I framed it as something we'd get through together. I reminded her about the rules, the ones she'd heard since she was old enough to understand that Mommy's job came with invisible lines. Stay close, stay quiet, don't make anyone notice you. Being invisible had saved me more times than I wanted to admit. Hazel nodded like she was taking an oath. That's what she always did. She listened with this seriousness that didn't fit her small shoulders. Sometimes it made me proud. Sometimes it made me ache. Because kids weren't supposed to carry that kind of discipline. On the train into downtown Boston, she leaned into my side and watched the city slide past the windows. Her eyes tracking everything with that alertness she'd had since she was 4. That was the year I realized Hazel wasn't just smart. She was different. I still remembered the first time it happened. The first time her gift made the world around us feel tilted. A woman in our building had been yelling in Spanish on the phone, loud enough for the whole hallway to hear. Hazel had been coloring on the kitchen floor, barely paying attention. And then she'd looked up and repeated the woman's words back, perfect accent, perfect rhythm like she was parroting a song. I'd frozen. The crayons had slipped right out of my fingers. After that came French from a cooking show, Mandarin from a tourist couple on the subway, a scrap of Arabic from a radio segment. One listen, and it was hers. Doctors had used long words and careful smiles. They'd called it rare. They'd called it unusual neurological wiring. They'd said there was no harm in it, no danger. But doctors didn't know what I knew. Anything extraordinary could become a target. And after Ethan, after losing the only person who made the world feel less sharp, I couldn't afford more targets in my life. So I did what I always did. I hid it. I taught Hazel to hide it. I turned it into a secret between us, like a precious thing wrapped in cloth and buried deep, because if the wrong hands found it, it wouldn't stay precious for long. By 5:45 p.m., we were slipping through the service entrance of the Hawthorne Hotel, the kind of historic place that smelled like old money and polished marble. The lobby chandeliers threw warm light across floors so shiny they looked wet. Men in tailored tuxedos and women in gowns that shimmered like water drifted past the velvet ropes as if they'd never had to worry about a late fee in their lives. Hazel's hand tightened around mine. She was brave, but she wasn't clueless. She felt the difference between our world and theirs. I guided her down the staff hallway, where the air changed immediately. Less perfume, more bleach. Less laughter, more clipped commands. The world behind the curtain that made the glamorous world possible. In the locker room, I helped Hazel settle on a folding chair in the corner, while I changed into my uniform black vest, crisp white shirt, bow tie that always felt like a noose. I kept my movements fast and calm, because if I stopped to think about what I was doing, I might not be able to move at all. I gave her the small notebook I kept in my bag and the colored pencils that were worn down from use. I watched her fingers curl around them like they were a lifeline. Then I crouched to her level and made myself look into her eyes. I reminded her again what she already knew. She had to stay hidden. The gala was in the grand ballroom, and there were too many eyes tonight. Too many people who expected perfection. Too many people who wouldn't see Hazel as a child who needed her mom, but as a problem, a liability, something that didn't belong in their curated world. Hazel nodded again, steady. Her mouth pressed into a small line like she was trying not to disappoint me. I led her through a side door that opened into a narrow alcove draped with heavy velvet curtains, tucked behind a decorative wall that separated the ballroom from the service corridor. From inside, she could see the room through a slim gap. From outside, nobody could see her unless they went looking. I tucked her in like she was a secret I was burying. My chest tightened as I did it. I hated that I had to. I smoothed one braid back behind her shoulder, kissed the top of her head, and told myself this was just for a few hours, just until the shift ended, just until I could pick up my paycheck and breathe again. But when I stepped back into the service corridor, something in me refused to settle. I'd worked events like this before. I'd served the wealthy, the powerful, the donors, who smiled for cameras and made promises over champagne. I knew the rhythm: setup, speeches, auctions, applause, dessert. Tonight felt different. I saw it in the way the security staff stood. Not the hotel's usual polite guards in their neat uniforms, but men who wore black suits that fit too well and earpieces that looked too new. They didn't lounge. They didn't chat. They watched. I noticed how the side exits were being monitored more closely than normal, like the doors mattered. I caught a glimpse of a man near the ballroom entrance who didn't look like a guest or staff. He looked like the kind of person who decided whether rooms stayed calm or turned violent. His posture was loose, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the crowd as if he was memorizing threats. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was projecting my anxiety onto strangers because I'd spent years expecting the floor to fall out from under me. Still, the unease stayed. I adjusted my vest, took a deep breath that tasted like sanitizer and nerves, and pushed through the double doors into the ballroom. Warm light flooded my face. Music floated from a string quartet. Conversations hummed like a carefully controlled machine. I slipped into my role, smile, nod, tray balanced, shoulders relaxed. Invisible. But as I moved between tables, I felt Hazel's presence behind the curtain like a heartbeat I couldn't ignore. And I couldn't shake the thought that my decision, made out of desperation at 2:15 p.m., had just placed the most precious thing in my life inside a room full of predators. I didn't know yet what Hazel was about to see through that narrow gap in the velvet drapes. I only knew my instincts were screaming, and for the first time in a long time, I was afraid that being invisible wouldn't save us. I kept moving because standing still was the fastest way to get noticed. The ballroom glowed with soft gold light, but from where I carried my tray it felt like a stage built over a trap door. The quartet played something elegant. Donors laughed like the world had never taken anything from them. I moved between tables with a practiced smile, refilling water, clearing plates, reading silent signals before anyone had to ask. Every few steps, my eyes flicked to the corner where the velvet drapes hid Hazel. I could not see her, but I could feel her presence like a thread tied around my ribs. The whole night balanced on that thread. It was around 6:45 p.m. when my unease stopped being background noise and turned into a warning. 4 men entered together, quiet and precise. Immaculate suits, polite smiles, the kind of faces people trusted because they looked composed. But their eyes did not wander toward the decor or the auction items. Their eyes measured exits, staff routes, and the ring of security around the room. I tried not to judge. I tried to tell myself I was projecting. Then I noticed how the men in black suits with earpieces shifted when the 4 passed. Not hotel security. Something tighter. Something trained. I angled my body as if adjusting my tray and glanced toward Hazel's hiding place. A cold draft slipped in when the ballroom doors opened, and the harbor chill reminded me the city was still winter. I passed the service station, swapped my tray, and forced my hands steady. Behind the drapes, Hazel was doing what she always did when she felt cornered. She watched mouths. She could not hear everything, but she did not need to. She tracked jaw tension, the tiny pauses between words. She noticed one man speaking English, then switching languages the moment a server turned away. She noticed another tapping 2 fingers against his cuff like a signal. She noticed a third checking his phone low, screen hidden by his palm. I told myself it was nothing. But Ethan used to say danger announces itself in patterns before it announces itself in noise. My stomach tightened as the patterns stacked, and I couldn't see the picture. Later, Hazel told me she had been watching from the moment those men stepped into the light. She said her gift did not feel like magic. It felt like patterns clicking into place. One sentence, one rhythm, and her mind filed a language where it belonged. She also said the scariest part was not understanding words. It was understanding intent. At first the men spoke English, easy compliments and harmless small talk. Then, every time a server drifted close, their lips stilled. When the server passed, their mouths moved again, but the sounds changed. Hazel recognized it after a breath, not because she had studied it, but because she only needed to hear it once. She watched their mouths the way I had taught her to watch hands on the subway, carefully, quietly. She caught words that made no sense in a charity ballroom. Target, window, opportunity. Another that landed like ice. Revenge. While Hazel was piecing that together, I was fighting my own smaller panic. A supervisor brushed past, and I forced my smile wider. I kept imagining Hazel's braids appearing between tables. I kept seeing my paycheck vanish. The rent, the heat, the thin line between us and the dark apartment I pretended was temporary. Then the four men separated. It was smooth enough to look accidental. They drifted with the crowd as if pulled by conversation. But Hazel saw the geometry. One near the bar, one near the service doors, one near a side exit, one closer to the front. They kept sightlines on each other without turning their heads, and their lips formed short phrases that matched across distance. Coordination, not coincidence. Hazel also noticed the bottle. One of the men approached the head server with a generous posture, the kind that looked like a gift. He gestured toward a specific bottle, and Hazel saw the head server's shoulders straighten, his smile becoming professional. The man's mouth shaped words about rarity and honor, about serving it to the most distinguished guest immediately. Hazel heard a word that meant glass, another that meant special, another that meant now. I did not see the bottle yet. I only felt the room subtly rearrange itself, as if an invisible tide shifted. Near the front, the VIP table sat with a wider ring of space around it. People leaned back slightly, wanting to be seen but not too close. Security posture changed. The air tightened, the way it does when someone powerful arrives and everyone pretends they are not paying attention. I was carrying scallops when I caught my first clear glimpse of him. He was not loud. He did not perform. He simply existed in a way that made space obey. A man whose presence reorganized the room. His suit fit like it had been designed for his body alone. His face was controlled, but his eyes moved like a scanner, cataloging threats the way my own instincts cataloged bills. I did not know his name then. I only knew he was the kind of man you did not interrupt unless you had no other choice. Hazel saw him too. And Hazel saw the four men watching him like a clock. She understood enough to know that pretty bottle carried a countdown, a plan meant to look natural, a sickness no one could argue with. She watched the head server lift the bottle and start toward the VIP table, and the fear that rose in her was the kind that makes rules feel small. Her pencil slipped from her fingers. The sound was tiny, but I felt it anyway, a ripple in the air behind the drapes. I turned, and my heart dropped because I saw Hazel slip out of her hiding place and step into the ballroom, her braids swinging, her eyes locked on the VIP table like she was running toward a fire. In that second, I did not know what she knew. I only knew she was about to be seen, and whatever was coming next was already in motion. Hazel moved like a spark that had slipped out of my hands. One second, she was supposed to be behind velvet, safe and unseen, and the next she was weaving through a forest of gowns and tuxedo legs, her braids flying. I tried to reach her, but my tray was in my hands and my feet were trapped in etiquette. My mind still clung to the old fear that the worst thing that could happen tonight was getting fired. Then I saw where she was going. The VIP table sat near the front with an empty ring of space around it. Even the richest guests gave it room, angling away from the man who sat there like he belonged to the building. He hadn't spoken much, but his stillness carried authority. The closer Hazel got, the more I felt the room tighten. I shifted to block her, but she darted past me with the speed only a child has when she believes she is right. My heart slammed as the head server approached the table with a bottle held like a trophy, smiling like this was a generous gift. Hazel's eyes were locked on the glass. I had no idea what she had seen through that curtain. I only knew she had broken the one rule I'd begged her to follow, and she was about to do it in front of the most dangerous-looking man I'd ever served. The head server began his smooth presentation, words spilling as easily as the champagne had all night. He angled the bottle toward the man at the table, and the man didn't lean in. He just watched, eyes steady, expression controlled. Hazel reached my side, breathless. Her small hand grabbed my vest, and in that grip I felt her fear. I started to shake my head, already forming apologies, already imagining my supervisor's face. The bottle tilted. The liquid slid toward the rim of the glass. Chandelier light turned it pale and pretty, like melted gold. I remember thinking how insane it was that something could look harmless and still feel wrong. Hazel moved. She didn't hesitate. She knocked the glass away from the place setting with one decisive swipe. The glass lifted, arced, and hit the marble floor with a crack that sliced through the music. The ballroom fell silent. Conversations froze. Forks paused. The quartet faltered. The spill spread across the marble in a shimmering puddle, and the shards glittered under the chandeliers. Heat flooded my face. Humiliation came first, automatic and familiar. I grabbed Hazel and pulled her back toward me, trying to hide her even though it was too late. Then Hazel's mouth moved, and everything inside me shifted. She wasn't making up a story. She was telling me, in frantic little bursts I can still replay, that the drink had been meant to hurt him. She said the 4 polished men had been speaking in a language she recognized after one listen, and they had timed it. She said they expected it to look natural. She said the bottle was wrong, and the glass was the trap. My arms tightened around her as the meaning landed. This wasn't about my job anymore. This was about a life. The man at the table finally moved. Not with panic, with control. Hazel looked up at him without the flinch most adults would have. Her chin lifted, not defiant, just certain. That scared me almost as much as the broken glass. Kids were supposed to fear the wrong things, and she was looking at him like she could read him the way she read mouths. The spill crept toward the toe of his shoe, and still he didn't jerk back. He simply watched, absorbing every reaction right up close. I felt his attention move over me too, taking in my trembling hands, my uniform, the way I positioned my body between him and my child. It was the first time I understood that men like him didn't just notice danger. They noticed leverage, loyalty, weakness, courage, and he had just seen mine in 1 second. He looked at the spill, then at Hazel, then at me, as if we were pieces that had just slid into a new position on a board he'd been studying for years. His gaze swept past my shoulder to the far side of the room, where I knew the 4 men stood scattered like they belonged to different conversations. He didn't raise his voice. He made a small movement with 2 fingers against the table. Subtle enough most guests wouldn't notice, but the men in black suits noticed. They shifted immediately, flowing around the room as if they were part of the evening. One angled toward the head server, another toward the bar, another toward the side exit. It happened in seconds, quiet and practiced. Across the ballroom, I caught the briefest flash of reaction from the 4 men Hazel had watched. One of them stilled, his smile tightening. Another glanced toward the service doors, measuring distance. A third checked his partner's position. They tried to look calm, but their bodies betrayed them. My supervisor appeared at my elbow, anger in his posture. I was already bowing my head, already bracing for the consequences. The man at the VIP table didn't allow it. Only then did I hear his name, passed in a whisper nearby like a warning. Graham Keller. The way people said it told me he wasn't just a donor. He shifted in his chair, and my supervisor's anger drained into politeness. The room pretended it hadn't been staring. I tried to move, to pull Hazel away, to disappear back into the staff corridor before anyone could decide we were a problem. But I barely took a step before his attention latched onto me like a hand. Graham's voice didn't need volume to stop me. It was calm, measured, and final. He wanted to know how my daughter had understood what those men said. The question didn't sound loud. It didn't need to. Graham Keller asked it the way a man might ask the time, calm and clean. But it stopped my body like a hand on my spine. My first instinct was to apologize again, to scoop Hazel up and vanish into the staff hallway, before the hotel decided I had ruined the night. But when I turned, I realized something that made my throat go tight. He wasn't asking because he was curious. He was asking because he already believed Hazel. My arms stayed locked around her shoulders. Hazel felt small against me, but her posture was steady. I could feel her heartbeat through the thin fabric of my uniform, quick, but not panicked. It was mine that was threatening to break open. I tried to move backward. Not dramatic, not obvious. Just a slow step the way you retreat from a barking dog you're not sure will bite. Graham's attention held me in place anyway. Up close, he didn't look like a gala guest. He looked like someone who used gala guests as scenery. His suit was perfect, yes, but it wasn't the expensive fabric that made him intimidating. It was the stillness, the way he didn't fidget, didn't blink too often, didn't glance around for reassurance. His eyes stayed on Hazel, then slid to me, as if comparing us. I could almost see him calculating. Threat, truth, leverage, risk. My mind scrambled for a lie that wouldn't get Hazel hurt, but the truth pushed forward because I didn't have the energy to build a fake life on the spot. I'd spent years doing that already. I told myself I could play dumb. I told myself I could pretend Hazel had guessed. Children guess things all the time, except Hazel hadn't guessed. Hazel had known, and she'd known in a way that left no room for coincidence. I felt her shift under my arm, like she wanted to step closer, not away. That terrified me more than the broken glass. Kids were supposed to cling to their mothers around men like him. Hazel didn't. In my memory, her face stays clear in that moment, eyes bright with a kind of quiet focus. She looked at him like he was a puzzle that interested her, not a predator that should scare her. I remember thinking that Ethan would have called it Hazel's curse and her blessing at the same time. The way she saw patterns, the way she understood things faster than she should. I explained it in the only way I could without making it sound like a circus trick. I confessed that Hazel had an unusual gift, that she could pick up languages after hearing them once, that she watched mouths the way other kids watched cartoons, that she noticed what most people missed. As I spoke, I hated myself a little, because I was handing my daughter's secret to a man who lived in a world built on secrets. Graham's expression didn't soften, but something in his gaze sharpened, like he was testing the edges of a blade. I saw it in the small tilt of his head, the way he studied Hazel's face as if checking for performance. He didn't look like a man deciding whether to comfort a child. He looked like a man deciding whether the child was a lie. Hazel stayed calm, and I realized she had probably already decided that honesty was safer than fear. She had said something to him then, something simple in her child logic, the kind of statement that wasn't dramatic, but landed hard because it was so direct. In my mind, I remember it as Hazel quietly confirming that she understood what those men had been saying, and that the plan had been timed. It should have sounded impossible. But Graham didn't laugh. He didn't dismiss it. He accepted it the way he accepted the room's deference, like truth was just truth, even when it was strange. Around us, the Gala tried to glue itself back together. Servers moved in quickly to mop up the spill. Someone swept the shards as if erasing evidence. The quartet resumed with a shaky attempt at elegance. People started talking again, but softer, with that nervous energy that always follows a public disruption. And then my supervisor appeared, face tight with anger that had been simmering since Hazel stepped out from behind those drapes. I knew what was coming before he even opened his mouth. Termination. Embarrassment. The silent punishment of being blacklisted from every decent catering company in the city. The kind of punishment that didn't just hurt pride, it hurt children. My whole body went cold. I braced myself, ready to beg if I had to. Ready to swallow my dignity because dignity didn't pay the electric bill. But my supervisor never got to finish. Graham Keller shifted slightly in his chair, and the air around us changed again. It wasn't magic, it was power, the kind that makes grown men recalibrate their choices mid-sentence. Graham's response was controlled, almost bored. He made it clear without raising his voice that my employment status was no longer a decision the hotel got to make in public. He treated the mistake as irrelevant compared to the larger issue, and he made it sound like a simple matter of preference that I remain. My supervisor's anger drained into a strained smile. It wasn't kindness. It was ownership. And for a second, I didn't know which scared me more. I wanted to pull Hazel away, thank him, and run. But Graham's attention moved to his men, the ones who had shifted after the glass broke, and I realized they were not standing around doing nothing. In the background, the 4 polished men were no longer where they'd been. I saw movement near the service corridor, a brief cluster of black suits that didn't belong to the hotel, a quick escort through a side door meant to keep donors from noticing unpleasant realities. The head server who had held the bottle was being guided aside too, his hands hovering helplessly near his waist as if he didn't know where to put them. The bottle itself disappeared from the table like a magician's trick. One moment it was there. The next, it was gone into an evidence bag carried by a man whose face showed no emotion at all. Everything was happening quietly, efficiently, like a mess being cleaned up. Except I wasn't a mess. I was a mother, and my daughter had just become the most valuable thing in the room. Graham made a decision with the same calm he'd used to stop my supervisor. He indicated that Hazel would remain near him while things were handled. Not because he wanted to frighten me, I told myself, because he wanted eyes on her, because he believed the danger wasn't over. My protective instincts flared so hot I almost forgot where I was. Every part of me wanted to refuse, to clutch Hazel and run through the kitchen and out into the cold street. but I looked at the men in black suits and realized I wouldn't get 3 steps. Hazel's small hand squeezed mine once, quick and reassuring, the way she did when she could feel me spiraling. It was such a grown-up gesture that it broke my heart. Graham checked his watch with a casual glance, like the night was still on schedule. I caught the time from the angle of it around 8:10 p.m., and my stomach sank because I still had nearly an hour left on my shift. He made it clear, in a controlled instruction that left no room for debate, that I needed to finish my work as if nothing had happened. The gala had to stay smooth. Attention had to stay away from us. And while I did that, Hazel would be watched. I stepped back onto the ballroom floor with shaking hands and a tray that suddenly felt too heavy. My eyes locked on the VIP table, where my daughter now sat close to a man I didn't trust and couldn't defy. Hazel's gaze drifted past the chandeliers and the auction stage, tracking movement again, lips moving silently as she read what no one else could hear. And I knew with a sick certainty that the 4 men had not been the whole story. Going back to work felt like walking onto a stage after the curtain had already fallen. The gala's music returned, but it sounded thinner now, like the quartet was trying to stitch normal back together with trembling hands. Conversations resumed, with polite laughs that didn't quite reach people's eyes. The donors leaned into one another again, as if they could talk the disruption away. And I did what I'd been told. I smiled. I poured. I cleared plates. My hands moved on autopilot while my mind stayed stuck at the VIP table where Hazel sat too close to a man I couldn't refuse and couldn't trust. Every time I passed within sightline, my eyes snapped to her like a reflex. Hazel's small body looked even smaller against the size of that table. But she wasn't shrinking. She sat upright, shoulders squared, gaze scanning the room with an attention that made her look older than 7. It broke something in me. I hated that she had to be brave. I hated that I couldn't pull her away. The hardest part was the pretending, the acting like the broken glass had been a clumsy accident, like Hazel hadn't saved a stranger's life, like my life hadn't just cracked open. I carried a tray of sparkling water past the service doors and caught a glimpse of one of Graham's men guiding someone down a corridor that wasn't meant for guests. It happened in a blink, so smooth most people wouldn't notice. A hand at an elbow, a body angled toward a side exit, a polite posture that disguised force. The man being escorted looked like he'd been at the bar earlier. He kept his smile on, but his eyes were tight with calculation. He didn't look confused. He looked caught. Another black-suited man moved toward the head server with the same quiet efficiency. No shouting, no scene. Just a redirection that made it clear someone else owned the air tonight. I set down glasses at a donor table and forced my face into calm while my stomach tried to crawl into my throat. This was what Graham Keller did. He erased messes without letting the room see the dirt. And that meant the danger was real enough that it had to be hidden. I kept counting minutes in my head like prayer beads. My shift had started at 5:45 p.m. It was now around 8:30 p.m., which meant I had maybe 45 minutes left before we started breaking down. 45 minutes to keep breathing. 45 minutes to keep Hazel alive in a room full of people who had already tried to kill the man beside her. I wanted to ask someone what was happening. I wanted to demand answers. But I had learned something about power. When you didn't have it, questions were not safe. Questions were invitations to be noticed. So I did what I'd always done. I stayed invisible and watched. Hazel was watching too, but in a way I couldn't. Later, she told me she'd realized the 4 men were only the first layer. They weren't the whole operation. They were the test run, the visible hand that distracted while the hidden hand waited. From the corner of my eye, I saw Hazel lift her gaze toward the eastern exit. The doors there led to a quieter hallway and a set of stairs. Most guests didn't use them. Staff did. Hazel's eyes followed someone standing near that exit. A man who didn't wear a staff uniform and didn't hold a drink. He leaned against the wall like he belonged there, but his mouth kept moving in short bursts. He wasn't talking to anyone beside him. He was speaking into something hidden, and Hazel read his lips like she was reading a book. Her gaze flicked toward the kitchen doors next. The swinging doors that opened and shut with a soft thump as servers moved in and out. 2 men stood near that area, blending into the shadows of the corridor, positioned where they could slip into the flow of staff without being questioned. They were waiting. Hazel's small hand lifted slightly, a tiny gesture I almost missed. It wasn't waving. It was a signal, the kind a child invents when she knows she can't shout. My breath caught. I adjusted my path and drifted closer to the VIP table under the excuse of clearing plates. I couldn't stop. I couldn't linger, but I could pass close enough to see Hazel's face. Her expression was tense, not with childish impatience, but with concentration. She looked at me, then past me, then back again. Her lips moved in a quick, silent way that told me she was trying to communicate without being obvious. I didn't need words to understand her message. There are more. My vision tunneled. I felt my knees threaten to go soft, and I forced them to lock. I couldn't afford to collapse. Not here. I moved away before anyone could notice my face shifting. As I crossed the ballroom, I caught a sound that was almost nothing. A name, repeated in a low, careful way by someone near the service station. It wasn't spoken like casual conversation. It was spoken like a warning. Kurosawa. I didn't know what it meant, but the way it sat in the air made my skin prickle. It sounded like something that carried history, like a name that opened doors and closed throats. I passed another donor table, refilled water, and listened harder. The Gala's chatter created a blanket of noise, but I could feel something moving underneath it. Graham's people shifting positions, sealing off corridors with their bodies, redirecting staff routes without issuing obvious orders. A man in a black suit appeared near the service station holding a small, sealed bag. Inside it, I saw the bottle that had been presented as a gift. He didn't announce it. He didn't show it off. He carried it the way you carry something that can ruin lives if it ends up in the wrong hands. Another man held what looked like a quick field test kit. I saw the briefest flash of a strip changing color beneath the shadow of his palm. His jaw tightened. I didn't hear the words, but I saw the meaning in his face. Hazel had been right. My stomach rolled as if the floor had tilted. I imagined the liquid sliding down Graham's throat. I imagined the room applauding a speech while he quietly died at the table. I imagined how easily everyone would have believed it was natural. A tragedy. A sudden health event. The kind of story people told over coffee the next day, and my daughter had stopped it with a single slap of her hand. I looked back at Hazel again. She wasn't smiling. She was watching the kitchen doors, tracking the men waiting there, tracking their patience, their timing. I realized something then that made my breath turn cold. Hazel wasn't just a child who had overheard a plan. Hazel was now a witness to a failed attempt. And whoever Kurosawa was, they didn't like witnesses. I felt the pressure of time tighten like a noose. Every minute that passed was a minute they could improvise. Every minute was a chance for a backup plan to ignite. I caught a glimpse of Graham at the VIP table, still composed, still calm. He didn't look like a man relieved to be alive. He looked like a man confirming what he already knew, that someone had tried to take him out, and now he had to decide how to respond. Hazel leaned slightly toward him, her mouth moving again. I saw Graham's eyes shift to the eastern exit without turning his head. I saw one of his men adjust position immediately, cutting off that route like a door quietly locking. No one clapped. No one gasped. The donors kept talking about charity and impact and community. Violence was happening in the seams. By 9 p.m., my legs ached and my throat felt raw from holding in panic. I could taste metal at the back of my tongue, the way fear always made me taste metal. I kept telling myself I just had to get to the end of my shift. Just get Hazel out. Just get home. Then I remembered the black suits near the service corridor and the way they'd moved the bottle like evidence. Home didn't feel like a safe word anymore. When I passed the VIP table one last time, I saw Graham check his watch. The motion was casual, but it landed in me like a countdown. I understood without hearing a single direct command that my shift was almost over, and when it ended, I wasn't going back to my apartment. I was going wherever Graham Keller decided was safe. And the worst part was, I wasn't sure if safe and trapped were going to feel any different. A little after 9 p.m., the ballroom started to soften at the edges. Dessert plates thinned out. Donors drifted toward the exits with that satisfied glow people get when they've done something good without getting too uncomfortable. Staff moved faster, clearing quietly, stacking trays, preparing for teardown. The air that had been tightly controlled all night loosened just enough for exhaustion to rush in. That was when I realized I wasn't going home. I didn't even get the chance to pretend I had a choice. One of Graham Keller's men appeared near the service station like he had been there the whole time, waiting for the exact second my shift ended. He didn't touch my arm. He didn't bark orders. He simply positioned himself in my path in a way that made it obvious the hallway belonged to him. I remember my hands trembling as I untied my apron. I remember my supervisor avoiding my eyes, suddenly very busy with inventory. I remember the hot sting of shame because other servers watched me like I was a story they'd gossip about on the train home. The waitress whose kid crashed the gala. The waitress who ended up in the orbit of the man everyone whispered about. I found Hazel at the VIP table exactly where I'd left her. Small, composed, sitting beside luxury that didn't belong to her. The table was being cleared now. But Graham remained seated, calm as if he could sit through an earthquake without spilling his drink. Hazel looked up the moment she saw me, and I almost buckled with relief. I wanted to scoop her into my arms and run, but there were men in black suits standing close enough that running would have been a joke. Hazel slipped her hand into mine. Her fingers were warm, mine were cold. Graham's attention lifted, and it felt like the room narrowed again. He gave a simple instruction through one of his men, the kind of instruction phrased politely but built like a locked door. I understood that we were to follow. Now, quietly. I nodded because refusing felt impossible. We moved through the service corridor, away from chandeliers and violins and donated money, into the back of house world where everything smelled like bleach, coffee, and sweat. The carpet turned to tile. The warm light turned to fluorescent. Doors swung open and shut behind us, cutting off the ballroom like a dream. Hazel stayed close, but she wasn't clinging. She was watching. She tracked faces the way I tracked bills. She noticed which staff member's eyes went wide, which security guard's jaw tightened, which man in a black suit kept checking the corner of the corridor as if measuring timing. She looked up at me once with that unsettling calm, and I felt both pride and heartbreak. A child shouldn't have to read danger. The elevator we reached wasn't the one guests used. It wasn't even the one staff used. It sat at the end of a short hallway with no decorations, just a plain door and a keypad. One of Graham's men entered a code without hesitation. Another scanned a fingerprint. The doors opened with a soft chime that sounded too gentle for something that felt like a vault. Inside, there were no buttons. Not the kind you could press casually and decide your own destination. One of the men tapped a panel that read his hand the way my phone read my face. Then the doors closed, sealing us into silence. The elevator moved so smoothly I barely felt it, but my stomach dropped anyway. Hazel looked up at the mirrored ceiling, fascinated by her reflection, the way kids always are. Then her gaze flicked sideways toward a small camera in the corner. She noticed it, even if no one mentioned it. I pressed my palm against her shoulder, grounding myself through her. The ride lasted seconds, but it stretched out in my head like a test. When the doors opened, the first thing that hit me was space. Not just a large apartment. A world. A floor-to-ceiling wall of windows revealed Boston spread out beneath us, the city lights glittering across the harbor like someone had scattered coins on black velvet. From up here, the streets looked clean and distant, the way poverty always looks from the top, tiny, manageable, almost unreal. My throat tightened with the whiplash. I thought of my apartment's peeling paint, the radiator that clanked, the stale smell of old carpet, the stack of unopened mail on my counter because I couldn't handle another number asking for something I didn't have. And here I was, stepping into a penthouse that looked like a museum of quiet power. Plush carpets swallowed the sound of our steps. Art hung on the walls like it had never been touched by human hands. The air smelled like expensive wood and something clean that wasn't bleach. Even the silence felt curated. It should have made me feel safe. Instead, it made me feel trapped. Graham's staff moved like shadows. A woman appeared to offer Hazel water. A man appeared with a blanket. No one asked questions. No one looked surprised. They behaved like this was normal, like women and children arriving under guard was just another part of the evening. That was when I understood the full shape of Graham's world. Luxury wasn't comfort. It was camouflage. Graham's men moved immediately into a room that looked like a wall until it shifted open to reveal monitors. Security feeds, floor plans, live camera angles of hallways and elevators and the lobby far below. Graham didn't waste time. Through his team, I learned that the bottle had been tested quickly and confirmed to be lethal. Not dramatic, not messy, just deadly in a way that could be mistaken for something natural. The kind of poison that didn't leave a confession behind. My skin went cold again. Hazel sat on the edge of a massive sofa, blanket around her shoulders, watching the monitors like she was watching a movie she couldn't pause. She wasn't smiling now. She was focused. One of Graham's men reported something else, and I felt my body tense before my mind caught up. There had been movement near my apartment building. Not earlier. Not tomorrow. Now, someone had accessed employee records through the catering company. Someone had matched my name to an address. Someone had taken the one fragile place Hazel and I called home and marked it. I heard that information like it was happening to someone else. Then I imagined Hazel's bedroom, her little stack of library books, Ethan's photo on the shelf, the grocery list on the fridge, the door lock I'd always trusted because I didn't have the luxury of imagining real threats. My knees weakened. I gripped the back of a chair to keep myself standing. I wanted to scream. I wanted to demand we go back and protect our things, our life, the pieces that still felt like us. But the truth was simple. If someone was watching my apartment, then going home wasn't brave. It was foolish. Graham made another decision, and it came down like a final verdict. We would stay here tonight under his protection. His men would handle the threat outside. He would arrange a more permanent plan in the morning. My chest tightened because the word protection sounded like safety, but it also sounded like possession. Like I had been moved from one cage to another. Only this cage had ocean views and armed guards. I was still trying to wrap my mind around that when Hazel leaned forward and pointed at one of the monitors. On the lobby camera, a man in a delivery uniform stood near the front desk. He held a clipboard. He looked ordinary. He shifted his weight like he was impatient. Hazel's face tightened with certainty. She had been reading his lips, even from the grainy feed, and she understood enough to know he wasn't delivering anything. He was waiting. And he was speaking in a language that didn't belong in a Boston hotel lobby. The alarm didn't sound yet, but in that moment, watching Hazel's small finger point to the screen, I felt the penthouse stop feeling like a sanctuary. It was a fortress, and something was coming for us anyway. By the time the city lights started to feel distant instead of beautiful, it was close to midnight. Hazel should have been asleep. Any normal 7-year-old would have been out cold after a day of school and a night of chaos, but Hazel wasn't normal, and tonight had stripped away any chance of pretending she was. She sat, curled under a blanket on the sofa, a children's cup of water in her hands, watching the security monitors like they were bedtime stories. I kept trying to soften the night for her. I smoothed her hair. I told her to rest. I pointed out the harbor lights and tried to make it sound like a treat, like some strange sleepover in a place we'd never see again. But every time I tried to pull her away from the screens, her attention snapped back. That was when she said it again, more firmly this time, her small voice carrying a certainty that made my stomach clench. The man in the delivery uniform wasn't delivering anything. I stepped closer to the monitors. The lobby feed showed him shifting from foot to foot near the front desk, clipboard in hand, head slightly bowed the way people do when they're trying to look harmless. The desk clerk leaned toward him, gesturing politely. The man nodded too much, the kind of nodding that read as fake even from grainy camera footage. Hazel leaned forward, eyes narrowed. She wasn't listening for sound. She was watching his mouth. Then her face tightened, and I knew she'd caught something. I asked her what she saw, but my words came out shaky, and I hated that my fear was leaking into her. She didn't answer like a kid. She answered like a witness. She explained, in the simple way she always did, that his lips were forming phrases that didn't match what his body was pretending. She said he was talking about access, about upstairs, about timing. She said he kept repeating a word that felt like a cue, something that meant go. Kurosawa. The name landed in the room like a cold object. Graham Keller stood across the suite, watching the same feed with an expression that didn't change, but his posture shifted. He wasn't startled. He wasn't surprised. He looked like a man recognizing a familiar enemy. One of his men spoke into an earpiece, posture tight, eyes focused. Another moved toward a panel in the wall that I had mistaken for decor. It slid open with silent precision, revealing a set of controls and something that looked like a hidden safe. The penthouse began to transform without drama. Locks engaged. I heard the soft, mechanical click of something sealing. A light above the suite door changed from green to a dull red. Somewhere deeper in the space, shutters started to lower over windows, not fully closing the view, but changing the angle enough that we couldn't be seen from outside. Luxury became lockdown. My skin prickled as the reality sank in. This wasn't a place designed for comfort. It was designed for siege. Hazel's gaze flicked to another monitor. The camera angle shifted to show the building's entrance again. The delivery man wasn't alone anymore. 2 more men had entered, moving with a confidence that didn't belong to a late-night lobby. They carried themselves like they expected doors to open for them. Their clothes were darker, more official-looking. One flashed something near the desk, an ID, a badge, something meant to make the clerk's spine straighten and their mouth form apologies. The clerk did exactly that. My stomach turned. For a second, my mind tried to grab onto relief. Police. Security. Someone official. Someone who could help. Hazel shattered that hope before it fully formed. She watched their mouths and shook her head, slow and firm. She didn't say they were bad men with a child's exaggeration. She said they weren't real authorities. She said their lips were speaking in the same language as the delivery man. She said they were using phrases about an extraction and about a floor number, as if they already knew exactly where to go. I felt my chest tighten, a hot pressure that made breathing harder. You could fake a uniform. You could fake a badge. You could fake safety. Graham's gaze didn't leave the monitors. but I sensed him registering Hazel's words like coordinates. He didn't question her. He didn't demand proof. He moved as if her perception was proof. He communicated something to his men, something short and decisive. The team responded instantly, spreading into positions around the suite. Not frantic, not loud, controlled, practiced. One man moved toward the private elevator entrance. Another covered a hallway. Another checked a closet door that looked decorative until he pressed a hidden latch and revealed a compact storage space stocked with gear I didn't want to think about. My hands went numb. I pulled Hazel closer, my fingers digging into her blanket. In that moment, I didn't care if Graham Keller was dangerous. I didn't care what he'd done in the world outside my small life. All I cared about was the fact that people who wanted him dead had decided Hazel and I were now part of the same target. Hazel kept watching. She counted the men in the lobby without being asked. She noticed the tiny things I would never catch, how one of them kept looking toward the elevators, how another's hand never moved far from his jacket, how their mouths formed the same repeated cue again and again like they were syncing a watch. She said the word extraction again, and my blood ran colder. It wasn't about arresting anyone. It was about taking someone out of the building, or taking someone out of existence. Graham's men brought up another camera angle. The building's service entrance, a side door most guests never saw. A figure slipped in through that door with a posture too careful to be casual. Then another. Then another. My throat closed. The lobby team was a distraction, a performance. The real movement was happening where cameras were fewer and staff were tired. Hazel leaned in and stared at that service feed, lips moving slightly as she read mouths even from a distance. Her eyes widened just enough to tell me she'd recognized the pattern. They weren't just asking for access. They were already inside. Graham made a decision then, and I felt it as much as I saw it. The air shifted. His calm turned into urgency without losing control. He didn't reassure me with gentle words. Men like him didn't do gentle. But his intent was clear. We were leaving. Now. One of his men guided Hazel and me toward a wall near the monitor room. I remember thinking it was an odd choice. There was no door there, no hallway, nowhere to go. Then the wall moved. A seam appeared where I'd seen nothing but smooth paneling. A section slid aside, revealing a narrow passage and a secondary elevator that looked older, more utilitarian, like it had been built for escape rather than convenience. My breath hitched. The sight of it made my fear more real, because it confirmed something I hadn't wanted to admit. Graham expected this kind of night. He had planned for it. As we stepped toward the opening, a distant sound filtered faintly through the building, muffled voices, a radio crackle, the subtle thud of footsteps where there shouldn't have been any. Hazel clutched my hand tighter, but she didn't cry. She glanced once at Graham, and her eyes held that strange calm again, like she understood him in a way I still couldn't. I took a step into the hidden passage, leaving the penthouse behind. And behind us, the fortress began to seal itself for war. The hidden passage smelled like old concrete and cold metal. It wasn't a hallway meant for people. It was an artery meant for emergencies, built for the kind of life I'd never imagined, escape routes carved into luxury the same way fear is carved into memory. The moment the panel slid shut behind us, the sound of the penthouse changed. The air got thicker. The muffled thuds from above became more noticeable, like footsteps or doors closing, or maybe just my imagination trying to put shape to danger. I kept Hazel close. Her small hand was locked in mine so tightly her knuckles went pale. Still, she didn't cry. Her eyes moved constantly, absorbing details the way other kids absorbed cartoons. A man in a black suit moved ahead of us, guiding the way. Another stayed behind, watching our backs. Graham Keller walked in the center like he'd done this 100 times, shoulders relaxed, mind already 3 steps ahead. I wanted to hate that calm. I wanted to shake him and demand why my child was in this tunnel at all, but fear rearranged priorities. In that tunnel, with Hazel's hand in mine and unknown men above us, my anger had nowhere safe to land. The passage narrowed at one point, forcing us into a single file line. The ceiling felt low enough that I ducked without thinking. My breath came shallow, tasting like dust. Hazel squeezed my hand once and leaned toward me as we walked, her mouth close to my ear. She didn't whisper like a child sharing a secret. She whispered like a spotter giving coordinates. She had counted the men on the monitors before we left. She remembered their faces. She had watched their mouths in the lobby, and she had understood enough to know the lobby team wasn't the main event. She said the word decoy the way a kid might say homework, casual but precise. I swallowed hard. Even hearing that word from her mouth felt wrong. Children shouldn't know decoy. The passage opened into a small landing, and the hidden elevator waited there. The kind of elevator built for utility, not comfort. Its metal doors looked older than the penthouse, scratched and dull, but sturdy. As we stepped in, the elevator shuddered once, then sank downward so smoothly it made my stomach lurch. Hazel leaned against me, her head tucked under my chin, but her eyes stayed open. I tried to breathe slowly, like I used to when panic attacks hit after Ethan died, and I'd lie awake in my apartment listening to sirens, convincing myself the world couldn't break me any more than it already had. But this was different. This was a world with rules I didn't know. The elevator opened into a private garage that looked nothing like the parking structures I'd used when I could still afford a car. This was clean, quiet, brightly lit. 2 black SUVs waited with engines already running, headlights dimmed. A third vehicle sat farther back, smaller, easier to miss, like a spare. Men moved with rehearsed choreography. One checked the garage camera feeds. Another inspected the vehicles. Another opened the rear door for Hazel and me without touching us, but close enough that I felt the invisible pressure of control. Graham said something to his men that I caught only in pieces through the buzz of my fear. It sounded like a report about the breach upstairs and the lobby distraction. It sounded like he was confirming they'd entered through a pattern he recognized. Then he said one thing reported by one of his men in a clipped, urgent way that made my blood run colder than any weapon could. The attackers were using his own protocols, not just similar tactics. His protocols. The kind of protocols that required inside knowledge. I felt my eyes sting. Paranoia wrapped itself around my ribs. If they knew his protocols, then someone close to him had leaked them. And if someone close to him could leak that, then what else could be leaking right now? My name. My address. Hazel. I climbed into the SUV with Hazel and pulled her close. The seat was soft, expensive leather that should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like a restraint. The door closed with a heavy thud that sounded final. The vehicle rolled forward, leaving the garage through a private ramp that bypassed the main lobby entirely. We emerged into the night like a ghost slipping out of a locked room. The city outside looked normal streetlights, a few cars, the distant glow of bars still open. It made me want to scream. Normal didn't mean safe. We moved in a small convoy, 2 SUVs ahead, 1 behind. I watched through the tinted window as Boston's streets passed like a movie scene I didn't recognize anymore. The harbor lights faded behind us. The buildings changed, shrinking, spacing out, turning into quiet neighborhoods that slept unaware of the storm hidden in our back seat. Hazel's head rested against my shoulder now, and I felt her finally start to droop. The adrenaline that had kept her upright all night was burning out. Her eyelids fluttered, but she still twitched at every change in speed, every turn, like some part of her refused to surrender vigilance. I stroked her hair, whispering soft nonsense into her ear just to keep myself from drowning in my thoughts. I kept seeing Ethan's face. My late husband's face in my mind was usually gentle, his tired smile after work, his hands smelling like printer ink and coffee because he always stopped at that little shop near our old place. He had been quiet, steady, the kind of man who made life feel manageable. He had died 5 years ago in what I'd been told was an accident, a late-night crash, a sudden loss, a tragedy that left me with a toddler and a grief that never fully healed. I had built my entire identity around surviving that moment, and now, in the backseat of a moving fortress, I felt that old grief stir like it had been waiting for something like this to wake it up. We drove for what felt like forever, but it was probably less than an hour. Time stretches when you don't know where you're going. Eventually, the city gave way to darker roads and taller trees. The air outside the SUV looked colder, the kind of cold that made breath visible. Coastal Massachusetts had that bite at night, even when the calendar insisted winter was still a few weeks away. When we finally turned onto a private road, the headlights swept over stone walls and bare branches. The property we approached looked like one of those houses I used to see online and immediately click away from because it made me feel poor in a way that was hard to name. A large home tucked behind trees, lights low and warm, landscaping that looked natural but too perfect to be accidental. Men were already stationed outside, dressed like they belonged there, like they were gardeners or maintenance workers, but their posture gave them away. Their eyes scanned the road, their hands stayed near places their jackets hid. The gate opened without a pause. We rolled in. When the SUV stopped, the quiet hit me first. No sirens, no music, no city hum. Just wind through branches and the distant sound of waves, faint enough that it could have been imagined. I stepped out with Hazel in my arms because she'd finally fallen asleep for real, her cheek warm against my shoulder. The house was warm inside. It smelled faintly of wood smoke and clean linen. Lights glowed in the corners instead of overhead, soft enough to pretend this was home. But I couldn't pretend. Not with armed men at the windows. Not with Graham Keller moving through the space like it was his, like he could own any place he stood. A woman appeared to guide us toward a bedroom upstairs. She didn't ask questions. She didn't speak to me like I was staff. She treated Hazel like a VIP. That should have felt kind. It felt wrong. When Hazel was tucked into a bed with thick blankets, I stood there for a moment just watching her breathe. The rise and fall of her chest was the only thing that made my own chest loosen. I walked back into the main hallway and found myself drawn to a table near the kitchen, where a folder sat half hidden beneath a sleek tablet. It wasn't labeled in big letters. It didn't need to be. My name was there. Claire Mercer. My throat tightened so hard it hurt. My fingers hovered over the folder like it might bite. I didn't even open it at first. The fact that it existed was enough. Graham's voice carried from the other room, low and controlled, giving instructions to his men. I heard him mention my apartment, the catering company, timelines, routes, like he'd been mapping my life for longer than tonight. I stared at that folder and felt a new kind of fear bloom inside me, one that had nothing to do with Kurosawa's men outside a hotel lobby. Because if Graham Keller already had a file on me, then tonight wasn't just an accident. It was an intersection that might have been planned. And I was suddenly terrified of what I was going to learn about Ethan next. The folder felt heavier than paper should feel. It was just a thin stack on a clean counter in a warm house. But the moment I saw my name printed there, my body reacted like it was a weapon. My pulse jumped. My palms went damp. My mind started building worst-case stories faster than I could stop it. I stood in the hallway with Hazel asleep upstairs and the sound of distant waves outside, and I realized I was afraid of knowledge in a way I'd never been before. Because if I opened that file, I couldn't close it again. I couldn't go back to the version of my life where Ethan's death was a tragedy and not a plot. I couldn't go back to believing survival was just luck and grit and long hours. Still, my fingers moved anyway. I opened the folder slowly, like I expected alarms to blare. Nothing happened. The house stayed quiet. The lights stayed warm. The only thing that changed was my understanding of my own life. The first thing I saw was a photograph. Ethan. My Ethan. Not a blurry picture from a funeral pamphlet. Not a candid shot from our last vacation. Not the soft man holding Hazel as a baby. This was a different image. He stood in a suit I didn't remember him owning. Shoulders straighter than I'd ever seen. Expression focused. Next to him was a younger Graham Keller. Not the polished power I'd watched at the Gala, but still unmistakable. Same eyes, same controlled posture, same air of someone who didn't need to raise his voice to be obeyed. I stared at that photo until my vision blurred. My chest felt like it had been hollowed out. Ethan had known him. Not in passing. Not like a waiter knows a regular. Ethan had stood beside him like an ally. More pages followed. Some were printed reports. Some were copies of bank statements. Some were notes written in a clean, careful hand I recognized even before I fully accepted it. Ethan's handwriting. I had seen it on sticky notes on our fridge, on birthday cards, on the backs of envelopes when he was calculating tips or grocery totals. It was the same handwriting that used to calm me because it meant something was organized, something was handled. Now it made my skin crawl. I flipped through transaction records and felt my throat tighten with each familiar number. There were deposits I had never questioned because I was too exhausted to interrogate miracles. Small sums that arrived at the exact moment we were drowning. The month Hazel got pneumonia and the hospital bill hit me like a brick. The random scholarship that covered her after-school program when I had to take a second job. The winter the landlord didn't raise rent, even though everyone else in our building got notice letters. I had called it luck. I had thanked God. I had told myself the world could still be kind sometimes. The records showed those deposits had been routed through shell names and legitimate fronts, then traced back in careful notes to one source. Graham Keller. My stomach turned. I remembered standing in my kitchen 5 years ago, counting quarters in a jar for laundry, crying silently so Hazel wouldn't hear. I remembered the day the power almost got shut off, and then an envelope appeared under my door with a cashier's check inside. No return address. I had felt relieved. I had felt ashamed. I had felt rescued by a faceless stranger. Now I realized that stranger had a name, and that name had been watching me. Behind me, I sensed movement before I heard it. I turned and saw Graham standing in the doorway of the adjacent room, his presence filling the space without effort. He didn't look startled to find me with the file open. He looked like he'd expected this moment as much as he'd expected the tunnel. He didn't approach fast. He didn't snatch it away. He let me stare, and then he gave his explanation through the calm, measured way he spoke to his men, the same way he had spoken at the Gala. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't apologetic. It was a statement of fact. He told me Ethan hadn't died in a random accident. He told me Ethan had worked inside one of Graham's legitimate fronts, handling financial structures that kept certain parts of Graham's world clean enough to pass inspections. Ethan had been brilliant with patterns and numbers, the kind of mind that saw connections other people missed. He hadn't been a muscle man. He hadn't been a thug. He'd been the quiet kind of dangerous, the kind who could dismantle an empire with a spreadsheet. I felt my hands start to shake. I wanted to say Ethan was just an accountant, just a husband, just a father, but the file in my hands made those words sound childish. Graham explained that Ethan had started tracking money that didn't belong, routes that didn't make sense, laundering pathways that tied powerful people to organized networks. The kind of networks Kurosawa used to survive and expand. Ethan had noticed patterns. He had followed them. He had kept records. And when he got too close, someone decided to erase him. My vision tunneled. My ears rang. It felt like someone had reached into my chest and reopened a wound I'd spent years stitching shut with overtime and cheap coffee and forced smiles. I remembered the night Ethan died. The police officer's careful voice, the report about slick roads, the way I'd stared at the kitchen clock, waiting for it to turn back and undo the call. If it had been engineered, then my grief had been orchestrated. My life had been manipulated from the start. Rage rose fast, hot, and ugly. Not just at Graham, at the world, at the men who killed Ethan, at Ethan himself for leaving me in the dark, because he had left me in the dark. Even if he thought he was protecting me, he had still lied by omission for years. He had let me believe our life was ordinary. He had let me mourn him as a victim of chance, not a casualty of a war I didn't know existed. I pressed my knuckles to my mouth to keep myself from making a sound that would wake Hazel. I was shaking so hard I had to grip the counter. Graham continued, and it felt like being forced to watch my own memories replay with new captions. He told me Ethan had made him promise something before he died. Not a vague promise, a specific one. That Graham would keep me and Hazel at a distance, financially supported, but uninvolved. That we would be protected without being pulled into the orbit. Graham had honored that promise for 5 years. Until tonight. Until Hazel slapped a poisoned glass and made herself visible. That was the part that broke me the most. Because it meant Hazel wasn't just in danger because she was gifted. She was in danger because she had inherited Ethan's legacy in a different form. Hazel had Ethan's pattern mind, just translated into language instead of numbers. The same sharpness, the same ability to read what others missed. I stood there with the file open and felt grief and betrayal and gratitude collide in my chest until I couldn't tell which feeling was which. And then Hazel appeared at the top of the stairs. I hadn't heard her wake. I hadn't heard her step out of bed. She stood there in an oversized sweater, hair messy, eyes too clear for a child who should have been sleeping. She looked down at the file in my hands and at Graham's face, and I saw her mind working the way it always did, fast, quiet, connecting dots. She came halfway down the stairs, stopping like she was trying to be brave without stepping fully into the adult storm. Her gaze landed on the photo of Ethan beside Graham. Something softened in her expression. Not happiness, but recognition. I realized then she wasn't shocked the way I was. She was grieving in a different direction. She had always been too young to remember Ethan clearly, but she had carried a shape of him inside her anyway. A sense of him. A hunger for answers she didn't have words for. Now she was watching those answers fall into place. She made an observation in that small, steady way that always startled me. She noticed the posture in the photo, the trust in Ethan's proximity to Graham. She implied, without childish drama, that Ethan must have believed Graham would keep his promises. That implication cut deeper than any accusation, because Hazel was right. Ethan had trusted him. I forced my breathing to slow. I told myself I could fall apart later, when Hazel wasn't watching. Right now, I needed clarity. I needed to know what came next. That answer arrived sooner than I expected, delivered by one of Graham's men entering the room with urgency written into his stance. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't panic. But the information he carried chilled the air. Kurosawa's people had located something connected to Ethan. A storage unit. A hidden cache. A place where Ethan had kept records Graham hadn't even known existed until now. And Kurosawa wasn't searching for it calmly. He was moving on it. My stomach dropped. Because if Ethan had left behind evidence, and Kurosawa believed Hazel could unlock it, then we weren't just collateral anymore. We were the key. And I could feel the next storm building, right outside the warm walls of this so-called safe house. By the time Graham's men said we had to move, the safe house didn't feel warm anymore. It felt staged, lights on, curtains drawn, pretending it could keep the ocean wind and the outside world away. It was a little after 1:30 in the morning when they brought the update to Graham. A storage facility outside the city, a unit number, a map, Ethan's hidden cache. The place he never told me existed. Part of me wanted to refuse, to lock Hazel in the bedroom and sit beside her until morning like we were still normal. But normal had died with that poisoned glass. Graham didn't ask permission. He directed his team in that clipped, efficient rhythm of his, and the house shifted again. Jackets appeared, keys clinked. A backpack landed near me with water, snacks, and a knit hat for Hazel. I should have been grateful. Instead, I felt like I was being packed. Hazel stood beside me in her socks, holding her stuffed rabbit by one ear. She watched the men's mouths as they moved through the room, not out of curiosity, but because listening had become her way of staying alive. We left in 2 vehicles, headlights low, tires crunching over gravel. The road out was narrow, lined with trees that looked like silhouettes. I stared into the dark and imagined eyes staring back. The closer we got to the city's outer edges, the more ordinary everything looked. Closed diners, a strip mall with a flickering sign, places you drove past without thinking, unless something terrible happened there. The storage facility sat behind a chain-link fence in an industrial stretch that smelled faintly of salt and engine oil. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, turning the asphalt the color of old teeth. A sign warned the area was monitored, but I didn't trust signs anymore. Graham's men moved first, scanning angles, slipping through the gate like they belonged there. Hazel pressed closer to me, eyes tracking the shadows between rows. She stared at the office window where a tired night manager sat behind glass, scrolling on a phone. Then Hazel's shoulders tightened. She tilted her head and watched a reflection in the office glass, reading lips that weren't facing us. She told me, quietly and with maddening calm, that 2 men near the far corner were speaking Japanese to each other, using short phrases about the unit and the girl. My throat closed. I didn't want her to hear herself reduced to that. Graham heard her report through one of his men, and his expression hardened. He didn't look surprised. He looked irritated, like Kurosawa's people had shown up early. Ethan's unit was in the back row, a plain metal door with peeling numbers. It should have been boring. It should have been boxes and old furniture and the ghosts of a normal life. But the moment the key turned, my stomach flipped. Ethan had hidden this from me on purpose. The door rolled up with a grinding sound that felt too loud. Inside, the unit smelled like cardboard and dry dust. Stacked bins lined the left wall. A folded stroller sat near the front, like a prop to sell an ordinary story. And behind the bins, wrapped in a faded towel, sat a steel lockbox. Next to it was a notebook sealed in a plastic bag. Not taxes, not receipts. A notebook with tabs and symbols I didn't recognize. My hands shook as I reached for it. Graham didn't stop me. He watched, letting me choose what to learn. Hazel crouched beside the lockbox, eyes narrowing. She traced the engraved numbers on the latch like she was reading a secret language. I opened the notebook first. Ethan's handwriting filled the pages. Blocks of numbers, then sudden strings of words in different languages. Not sentences, keys, patterns. A mind mapping routes through a labyrinth. My chest hurt so badly I thought I might fold right there on the concrete. An envelope was tucked inside the plastic bag, sealed, addressed in Ethan's careful hand. Not to me, to Hazel. Every maternal instinct screamed to hide it, but that instinct was outdated now. Hazel had already stepped into adult danger. She deserved whatever Ethan had left for her. She opened the envelope with steady fingers. Inside was a single sheet and a smaller card. Ethan's sheet read like a bedtime note and a warning at the same time. He told her he was sorry he couldn't explain everything. He told her her mind worked like his, that she would see connections other people missed, and that she should never feel ashamed of it. He told her that if she was reading this, someone had tried to use that gift against her, and the truth could protect her if she learned how to unlock it. The smaller card was covered in symbols and 5 short phrases in different languages, arranged like a puzzle. Hazel stared at it, focus sharpening, grief and curiosity twisting into something almost like purpose. She murmured that the phrases were layered, a language key and a pattern key together. Ethan had built a lock only she could open. I swallowed hard. Ethan had planned for his own death, and for our survival, and that planning felt like love and betrayal in the same breath. Outside the unit, a soft click sounded. One of Graham's men stiffened. Hazel's head snapped up. She whispered that the men at the far corner were moving. She said their mouths formed a phrase she recognized now, a code for closing the net. She counted at least 6 spreading across lanes like they were avoiding cameras. Graham's posture shifted. He ordered his team to pull what mattered and leave the rest. We shoved the notebook, the letter, and the card into the backpack. The lockbox was heavier than it looked, but I hauled it anyway, because Ethan had wrapped it like it held his heart. As we stepped out, I saw the night manager glance up, startled. Then his gaze flicked away too quickly, like he'd been told not to see. Compromised. Again. We moved down the lane, quiet and fast. I held Hazel's hand so tightly I worried I was hurting her, but she didn't complain. She was watching mouths, counting bodies, mapping danger like it was math. We reached the vehicles just as headlights flared at the far end of the facility. Plane headlights coming too fast. Graham's men got us inside. Doors slammed. Engines surged. We burst through the gate before it could fully shut, metal rattling behind us like a scream. As the storage facility shrank in the rear window, I clutched the backpack to my chest and felt the weight of Ethan's secrets pressing into my ribs. Hazel leaned against me and said the card pointed somewhere else. A second place. A waterfront warehouse Ethan had photographed once, and she recognized it now from the phrases he chose. Then Graham's phone lit up with fresh alerts about movement near the safe house we'd just left. I realized we weren't racing toward answers anymore. We were racing toward Ethan's final hiding place, with Kurosawa closing in behind us tonight. The warehouse died the moment it tried to protect us. That sounds dramatic, but it's the only way I can explain how fast safety turned into a trap. 1 minute, I was standing in the glow of Ethan's emergency lights, clutching his letter like it could keep him close. The next, a monitor on the wall flickered and showed headlights crawling down the access road like a slow-moving infection. It was a little before 3 in the morning when Hazel leaned toward the screens, eyes narrowed, and I felt her small hand tighten around mine. She didn't need a siren or a warning. She had her own alarms. I watched her stare at the grainy camera feed and count moving shapes the way other kids counted stars. She indicated there were more than 20 this time, and the way they moved told her they weren't just desperate men showing up with guns. They were trained. Graham's men reacted before my fear could even catch up. Steel shutters dropped over the few high windows. A reinforced interior door slid into place with a hydraulic hiss. The warehouse, which had looked like a secret refuge, revealed itself as a prepared bunker. Ethan hadn't built a hideout. He'd built a last stand that also had an escape. That thought made my stomach twist, because it meant Ethan had known exactly what kind of night this would become. Hazel's gaze stayed fixed on one attacker who stepped into the edge of the camera frame under a floodlight. Even through the blur, I could see something dark on his neck, a shape that looked like a tattoo or a burn mark. Hazel recognized it instantly. She reported that he was the one giving orders, and that his mouth formed the same name over and over, Kurosawa, like it was a prayer or a threat. She added, with the kind of blunt honesty only a child could manage, that the men were repeating instructions to take her alive. Not me. Not Graham. Her. I felt my whole body go cold. My first instinct was to scoop her up and run, but we were already inside the place Ethan had chosen. If we were caught here, there would be nowhere left to go. Graham moved like a man who had accepted that fear didn't matter as much as time. He directed his people without raising his voice, and I saw his posture shift into something protective, without turning sentimental. He positioned 2 men at choke points, and another by the monitors. He had someone pack only what mattered: Ethan's USB drive, the notebook, the lockbox, Hazel's letter, because even in a siege, he understood that truth was the only weapon that could end this permanently. Then came the first twist that made my throat tighten. One of Graham's men received a message. I didn't see the screen, but I saw the flash of anger in Graham's eyes as he read it. He didn't need to say it out loud for me to understand what his face already confessed. Someone had leaked our movement. Someone who knew where we were. The betrayal didn't shock me the way it should have, because I was already learning how wide and dirty this world was. But it still hurt, because it meant Ethan's careful plan had been outpaced by greed and fear. Hazel's head tilted again, listening not just to the monitors, but to the building itself. She murmured that she could hear faint voices through the door, and that the men were coordinating in Japanese and English. She said one of them was using a phrase about police arriving soon, as if it was part of the plan. My stomach dropped, because that meant Kurosawa wasn't just bringing brute force. He was bringing disguise. He wanted confusion. He wanted us to hesitate at the wrong moment. Graham made the decision before I could even form the words to beg him. He indicated we weren't holding this position. The warehouse was a pivot point, not a fortress. Ethan's real genius wasn't the ability to hide. It was the ability to move. Graham's men guided us toward the hidden dock entrance beneath the building. The corridor felt narrower now, the walls closer, the air colder. Hazel's hand stayed locked in mine, The backpack pressed against my hip like a reminder that Ethan's secrets were heavier than our bodies. Above us, a hard impact shook the warehouse door, and dust drifted from the ceiling like the building itself was shedding skin. We reached the dock. The boat waited in dim emergency light, its outline sleek and ready, like Ethan had assumed someone would need it in the worst possible hour. Graham's men moved with practiced speed, checking fuel, securing life vests, scanning the water for shadows. I helped Hazel into the boat first, my hands shaking so badly I had to grip her shoulders to steady myself. She climbed in without crying, without begging, without even pausing. That was the part that broke me most. She looked like a child who had already accepted she couldn't afford to be one. We pushed off into the fog, and for a few seconds the world softened. The warehouse disappeared behind us. The sound of the tide filled the space where panic had been. Then Hazel leaned into me and whispered that we were being followed. She said she could hear another engine, then another, approaching fast from the East Channel. She described the way their mouths moved when they spoke to each other in the boat's headlights, and she identified their plan with terrifying precision. They wanted to cut us off near the wider water where their speed could trap us. Graham trusted her instantly. The boat surged into a narrow channel between derelict piers. The water churned, and the fog thickened until the world became a tunnel of cold air and salt. Spray hit my face. Hazel pressed close, and I wrapped the blanket around her like it could stop bullets. The pursuing boats appeared behind us, headlights slicing through the mist. The sound of their engines felt like teeth grinding. That was when the second twist arrived. A helicopter's distant thump rolled through the fog like an approaching storm. At first, my heart leapt with hope, and then it dropped again, because help wasn't always help. In Ethan's world, uniforms could be bought, and badges could be borrowed. Hazel lifted her head toward the sound, listening, focusing. She said she could hear amplified commands, and she caught enough to describe an accent and the clipped rhythm of an official operation. But then she tensed again and murmured that the men behind us were talking about police, as if they expected the arrival to work in their favor. They weren't afraid. They were counting on it. The fog suddenly lit up with a bright beam from above. A spotlight pinned one of the pursuing boats, turning the men inside into stark silhouettes. Another light followed. Radio chatter crackled through the air, and even without understanding every word, I felt the weight of it organized, coordinated, undeniable. The pursuing boat hesitated. In that hesitation, I understood something huge. This wasn't local police. This wasn't a private security trick. This was federal. The harbor filled with movement. Larger law enforcement craft surged through the fog in formation, cutting off exits like a net closing. The helicopter swept low enough that the wind slapped the water into chaos. The pursuing boats tried to break away, but they were boxed in. Hazel's eyes stayed fixed on the scene, and she did what she always did. She found the truth inside the noise. She indicated where the remaining Kurosawa men would run. She read lips through fog and glass and distance, and she offered details that made the federal operation pivot with startling speed. The clash that followed was mostly hidden by fog, more sound than sight, short bursts, rushing wakes, shouted commands muffled by distance, then silence. When dawn began to dilute the darkness, the world changed again. We were no longer running from Kurosawa. We were standing inside Ethan's long game. Graham's boat slowed as federal craft surrounded us. Weapons were raised, not fired. Orders were given with the kind of authority that didn't need threats. My stomach twisted into a knot, because now we were trapped in a different way. Hazel clutched my sleeve. Graham stood slightly in front of us without touching, like he was shielding us with his reputation and his body at the same time. Federal agents escorted us onto a dock. They moved with professional caution, treating everything we carried like it could explode. The backpack, the lockbox, the USB drive, Ethan's letter. One agent, tall, controlled, eyes sharp with suspicion, studied Graham as if she'd been waiting for him for years. I could feel the weight of his name in the air, heavier than any chain. Hazel looked up at me and I saw it in her face. She understood, even without anyone explaining, that the next danger wasn't a gun. It was a decision. And Graham, standing there in the pale light of morning with federal weapons trained on him, began to negotiate our survival with nothing but leverage, truth, and whatever loyalty Ethan's memory still carried in his chest. As they led us forward, I held Hazel's hand and tried not to shake, because the fog was clearing, and everything we'd been running from was about to be exposed. By the time the sun finally broke through what was left of the fog, my body had stopped shaking on the outside and started shaking on the inside. That's the part people don't warn you about the moment after survival, when your mind finally realizes it's allowed to feel everything it delayed. On the dock, I stood with Hazel tucked against my hip, her small fingers threaded through mine, like she was anchoring us both to reality. Federal agents moved around us in measured patterns, not frantic, not emotional, just controlled. They spoke into radios. They marked evidence bags. They photographed the backpack like it was a weapon, and maybe it was. Because inside that backpack wasn't just Ethan's handwriting and Hazel's notebook. Inside it was the truth that could ruin men like Kurosawa. A tall agent with a posture like a steel ruler approached the makeshift processing table. I noticed how she kept her hands visible, how she didn't flinch at Graham's name, and how she looked at Hazel the way people look at something rare and fragile at the same time. She introduced herself with the calm authority of someone used to chaos, and I caught her last name when another agent repeated it to log the scene. Special Agent Maren Holt. Even the way her name sounded made me feel small. Graham stood a step in front of us without touching us. He wasn't fighting. He wasn't pleading. He was doing what he always did, calculating. He held his shoulders steady as agents aimed rifles at his chest like they were taking measurements. I kept waiting for the moment his control would crack. It didn't. Agent Holt's team separated items into piles: paper, electronics, handwritten notes, and the sealed USB that looked too ordinary to carry so much consequence. When they opened Ethan's letter, they didn't read it out loud. They treated it like a confession, and that terrified me more than any gun ever had. A confession meant a case. A case meant courtrooms and records and the kind of public attention that turns a life into a headline. Hazel's eyes tracked everything. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't scared in a loud way. She was quiet, awake, observant, like she'd stepped into a world where children didn't get to be surprised anymore. At some point, Agent Holt's gaze shifted. Something about it softened, just for a second, like she'd seen too many mothers on docks like this, and hated that she could predict the next part. Her team confirmed that the boats they'd intercepted were tied directly to Kurosawa's crew. They confirmed the commander Hazel had identified, the one with the neck marking, wasn't just a thug. He was a key piece, a person who knew routes and contacts and safe drop points. Then came the first real revelation that landed like a punch and a hug at the same time. Agent Holt's team explained, carefully and clinically, that Ethan Walker wasn't just a victim. He had been working with them. Not openly. Not officially in the way people imagine. But deep. Hidden. So deeply buried that even some federal units didn't know the full scope. Ethan had built an evidence pipeline that fed into multiple investigations, and he'd designed it to survive him. He had set up a system something like a dead man switch that would release information if he stopped checking in. They told me the last check-in had been 5 years ago, the year he died, and my knees nearly gave out, because it meant the thing I had tried to accept as fate, a car accident, a cruel random moment, had never been random. Ethan had been killed, not because he was unlucky, because he was effective. I felt grief rise like acid in my throat, mixed with something even worse, betrayal. I thought about all the nights I cried into my pillow, believing my husband had simply been taken from me by the universe. I thought about how I had blamed myself for not making him take a different road, for not insisting he call me when he arrived, for not being the kind of wife who somehow senses danger. And now the danger had been real the whole time. Hazel pressed her cheek against my shoulder. She didn't cry. She just stayed close, and that steadiness nearly broke me because it felt like she'd been holding her own grief in her teeth for years without knowing why. Agent Holt's team didn't stop there. They explained that the evidence Ethan gathered wasn't just about Kurosawa's Bay Area footprint. It was bigger. Financial roots, political protection, shell companies, bribes, coordinated violence disguised as accidents. While I stood on that dock trying not to collapse, I watched helicopters lift off and disappear toward the city. I watched agents receive updates through earpieces and shift their focus like chess pieces being moved by someone invisible. It felt unreal, like the world was finally reacting to a war Ethan had been fighting alone. Hazel murmured softly that she could still see movement on the far side of the inlet. She pointed out a local patrol boat that looked wrong, the way the men inside carried themselves, the way one of them kept glancing at his phone as if waiting for permission. She said she had caught a phrase in Japanese earlier that implied local uniforms had been compromised. Agent Holt listened. Not dismissively, not indulgently. She listened like Hazel's words had already saved lives, and she wasn't arrogant enough to ignore that pattern. Agents moved. They confirmed what Hazel had sensed. A local officer was pulled aside. A firearm was secured. A phone was seized. In seconds, the dock felt even colder, because the boundary between law and crime had just been exposed again right in front of me. That was when I understood why Ethan had built everything the way he did. He hadn't trusted anyone completely. He had trusted systems, he had trusted leverage, and he had trusted the idea that truth, released at the right time, could force the world to act. Graham's negotiation happened in a space that wasn't dramatic, but it was heavy. Agent Holt and 2 other officials moved him a few steps away, still within sight of us, still within weapons range. They didn't handcuff him immediately. That small mercy told me everything about how valuable his position was. He offered cooperation, not emotional, not heroic, practical. He explained that he could provide testimony and documentation on specific operations, routes, and laundering networks tied to Kurosawa and other syndicates. He framed it as mutual benefit, federal success, dismantled threats, and in return, terms that protected Hazel and me. I could tell Agent Holt didn't like him, but she respected outcomes. And Graham Keller was offering outcomes. I stood there holding Hazel's hand while my entire future balanced on words I couldn't hear clearly. I read body language the way I'd learned to in hotel ballrooms. Who was tense? Who was impatient? Who was pretending to be calm? Then Agent Holt walked toward me with a folder. In her hands, she held my life like it was paperwork. She explained the options with that same steady tone. Witness protection was available. Relocation, new identities, new schools, safety, but at the cost of everything familiar. She made it clear that with Hazel's abilities, traditional concealment would be complicated. A child who could read lips across rooms and recognize languages instantly was not easy to keep invisible. People would notice. Teachers would notice. The wrong people would notice. So they had another option, one that felt less like erasure and more like structure. Specialized protection tied to the case. Federal oversight. Secure housing. A controlled schooling plan for Hazel, including therapy and evaluation that wouldn't treat her gift like a circus trick. Boundaries. Escape routes. A long list of rules designed to keep us alive without stripping Hazel of who she was. I stared at the folder and felt like I was standing at a fork in the road with fire behind me. For 5 years, I had survived by staying small, by keeping my head down, by being invisible, and yet invisibility hadn't saved Ethan. It had just delayed Kurosawa's reach until the day Hazel did something brave enough to shatter the illusion. Hazel looked up at me. Her eyes were tired, not sleepy. Tired like she'd been carrying questions no 7-year-old should carry. She didn't beg me for any choice. She just stayed close, trusting me the way children do when they have no other option. And in that moment, I made the decision that changed everything. I chose truth over disappearance. Not because I was fearless, because I was exhausted, because I couldn't spend the rest of Hazel's childhood teaching her that the safest thing she could be was invisible. I asked for conditions. I asked for Hazel's schooling to be stable, not constantly uprooted. I asked for therapy to be mandatory, not optional, because survival wasn't the same as healing. I asked for rules around who could access her, who could interview her, who could treat her like evidence instead of a child. I asked for the right to leave if the arrangement became a cage. Agent Holt listened. She didn't promise everything, but she didn't dismiss me either. She looked at me like she recognized something in my refusal to be passive. Then she nodded once, the smallest sign of respect. The last piece of the day came like a bruise you don't notice until you touch it. Graham was going to be taken. Not executed, not thrown away, but contained, moved, negotiated over, used as a piece in a larger case. I felt a sharp, confusing pain at that, and it startled me. I had spent most of this nightmare afraid of him, and yet, somewhere between the Gala and the fog and the dock, he had become the one steady thing between Hazel and danger. He had trusted her. He had protected us without demanding gratitude. He had treated Ethan's debt like something sacred. Agent Holt's people escorted us to a secure building as the sun turned orange over the water. Inside, everything smelled like coffee and disinfectant, like paperwork and exhaustion. Hazel fell asleep on a couch with her jacket still on, her fingers still curled around the edge of her notebook. I sat beside her and finally let myself feel the full truth of Ethan. He wasn't the ordinary husband I thought I married. He wasn't innocent, but he had loved us. He had planned for us. He had built a future in his mind and tried to protect it, even if it meant lying to my face for years. I didn't know how to forgive that completely. I still don't, but I understood, in the quietest part of my heart, that he had done what he thought was the only way to keep us alive. Later, when I saw Graham one last time before they moved him, he didn't look at me like he expected a romantic ending. He looked at me like he wanted me to remember one thing. I wasn't alone anymore, even if he was about to be. And I realized something else. Love, in the kind of story people assume they want, is all flowers and safe hands. But love, in the story I lived, was leverage. It was sacrifice. It was a man stepping into the light to pay a debt, and a mother stepping out of invisibility to protect her child's future. That night, Hazel slept, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't stay awake listening for footsteps. I stayed awake listening to her breathing. Steady, safe, and I promised myself that whatever came next, courtrooms, relocation, headlines, fear, I would not let Hazel's gift become her cage. If you've made it to the end of this story with me, I want to ask you something. Have you ever had a moment where you realized surviving wasn't enough, and you had to choose what kind of life you wanted after the danger passed? If this story moved you, please like the video, share it with someone who needs hope, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It means more than you know. The first time I slept through the night in our new place, I woke up angry. Not because I missed the fear, not because I wanted the chaos back, but because my body had learned to live in emergency mode, and peace felt like a trick. It felt like the quiet before something bad happened. The apartment they gave us was clean in a way my old one never had time to be. Neutral paint, heavy doors, windows that didn't rattle in the wind. The building had a lobby desk, cameras I pretended not to notice, and a maintenance guy, who never carried a toolbox but always seemed to know who walked in and out. Specialized protection, Agent Marin Holt had called it. Not a new identity, not total erasure, just a new kind of cage, with softer walls. Hazel adjusted faster than I did, but that didn't mean she was okay. It just meant she was practiced at adapting, the way kids learn to do when adults keep changing the rules on them. Every morning, she laid out her school clothes with the careful focus of someone preparing armor. Nothing too bright, nothing that stood out. Shoes she could run in, a backpack that fit close to her body. Then she would glance at me, like she was checking whether I was about to fall apart, and I would force a smile that felt like it belonged to a stranger. The new school had a gifted coordinator and a therapist on site, and it still broke my heart to walk her through those doors. It wasn't the school's fault. It was mine, in a way. I kept thinking that if I had known Ethan's secret sooner, maybe Hazel wouldn't have to learn the vocabulary of danger before she learned long division. But guilt isn't a time machine. It's just a weight. So I learned a new routine. Coffee I didn't taste, email I didn't understand, and a job training program the federal liaison recommended because it could be done remotely. The idea was stability, a legitimate paycheck, a paper trail that looked ordinary. I had wanted ordinary so badly for so long, and now that it was finally offered, it came with conditions. I couldn't post our location. I couldn't share details. I couldn't let Hazel's gift turn into a story someone bragged about on social media. I couldn't do anything impulsive, not even out of kindness, because kindness had almost gotten us killed. That part was the hardest. I hated that the world had taught me to hesitate before helping. Hazel's therapy sessions started at 2:30 in the afternoon, twice a week. The therapist taught her grounding techniques, ways to come back into her body when her brain tried to map every threat in a room. They called it hypervigilance. They explained it like it was a normal response to abnormal experiences. To me, it sounded like a fancy word for what motherhood had always been. A constant scan, a quiet fear, a love so sharp it turned into instinct. Some days, Hazel came out of therapy calm and light, like the session had emptied something heavy from her chest. Other days, she came out quiet, her eyes too old, and I would take her home and make grilled cheese and pretend it was enough. At night, when she slept, I sat on the edge of my bed and listened, not for footsteps, for her breathing. It became my proof of safety, my way of reminding myself that we were still here. Kurosawa's network didn't vanish overnight. It fractured. It collapsed in layers, the way buildings fall in slow motion when the foundation finally gives out. The news called it a sweeping international crackdown. They used words like syndicate and corruption and financial crimes. They didn't say my husband's name. They didn't say Hazel's. And I was grateful for that. But invisibility has a strange side effect. It doesn't just hide you from danger. It hides you from closure, too. There were no public apologies. No moment where someone announced Ethan was brave and wronged and worthy. In the official world, he remained what he had always been to everyone else. A dead man from a car crash 5 years ago. To me, he became two men at once. The husband who warmed his hands on my lower back when I was cold, and the strategist who built a bomb of truth and left it behind, like a gift with teeth. Weeks passed, then months, then one afternoon, when the air outside had the crisp edge of early winter, I received a sealed envelope with a federal return address and my name printed cleanly on the front, like it was nothing more than a utility bill. My hands shook before I even opened it. Part of me still expected bad news to show up with polite formatting. I waited until Hazel was in her room, doing homework with her tongue caught between her teeth the way Ethan used to when he concentrated. Then I sat at our kitchen table and broke the seal. Inside was a smaller envelope, older, yellowed at the edges. My throat tightened when I recognized Ethan's handwriting. Not a photocopy. The real thing. There were also legal documents, trust paperwork, education funds, therapy allocations, and a list of safe contacts that made my stomach drop, because it meant Ethan had planned for a life he knew he might not get to live. But it was the letter that undid me. I didn't read it like a document. I read it like a wound. Ethan had written it for me, dated weeks before he died, and seeing that date made my vision blur. He explained, in his steady, careful way, that he had been living in a double world for longer than he wanted. He admitted he had lied, and he didn't try to excuse it with romance or heroism. He framed it as a choice made under pressure, and he said he had been terrified that the truth would destroy me. He also said something that made me press my palm to my mouth to keep from making a sound. He wrote that he had noticed Hazel's gift early, not just the language part, but the way her mind found patterns, the way she heard meaning beneath words. He believed her ability was not a curse, it was a compass, but he worried the world would turn it into a weapon. So he left instructions, not orders, guidance. He included a list of books he wanted her to read at different ages, not just languages, but stories about resilience and boundaries and kindness without self-destruction. He outlined a therapy plan, not because he thought she was broken, but because he believed even strong minds needed safe places to unload what they carried. And then, near the end, he wrote the sentence that changed the way I held my grief. He said he had loved me for my tenderness, but he had respected me for my grit. He said he didn't want me to become hard. He wanted me to become clear. He wanted me to stop apologizing for protecting our daughter. He wanted me to choose a life where Hazel could be brilliant without being hunted. He ended by asking me to forgive him, not blindly, but honestly. He wrote that if I couldn't forgive him, he still hoped I would use what he left behind to build something safer. When I finished reading, I sat there and cried in a way I hadn't allowed myself to in years. Not the messy panic crying of the doc, not the silent crying of late-night bills. This was grief that had finally been given a name. I wiped my face and folded the letter carefully, like it was fragile enough to tear just from being remembered. Later that evening, Agent Holt called. She didn't give details, but she confirmed that the legal package had been recovered from secure evidence storage and released according to Ethan's instructions. She also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Graham's cooperation had held. He had not tried to bargain for more than he promised. He had paid the cost. A week after that, I received a second envelope. This one wasn't federal. It had no return address. It was delivered through the liaison office with chain of custody like it was dangerous. Inside was a single page. No dramatic declarations, no poetry, just a few lines written in blunt, controlled handwriting. Graham had conveyed, through permitted channels, that Hazel and I were safe because he made it his job to keep it that way. He acknowledged that trust wasn't something he deserved on demand. He said he understood that my boundaries were not insults, they were proof I had finally stopped being invisible. And he ended with something that felt almost unbearable because it was simple. He conveyed that Ethan's debt had been paid, but my life was not a debt, it was a choice, and he would honor whatever choice I made, even if it meant never seeing us again. I reread those lines until the meaning shifted from suspicion to something else, something quieter, something like hope. That night, Hazel asked me why I seemed sad but calmer at the same time. I told her, in the gentlest way I could, that her dad had left us something. Not just money, not just documents. He had left instructions for how to keep our hearts intact. Hazel didn't ask 100 questions. She just leaned into me, and I realized she had been waiting for me to stop floating in grief and start standing in truth. I don't know what the future looks like in a clean, protected apartment with hidden cameras and rules that feel like airless walls some days. I don't know what Graham's story becomes in courtrooms and negotiations and consequences he can't buy his way out of. But I know this. For the first time in 5 years, I'm not building a life out of fear. I'm building it out of clarity. Hazel still has her gift. She always will. But now she also has support, structure, and a mother who finally understands that being strong doesn't mean being silent. It means being present. If you stayed with me through this whole journey, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to rebuild your life after learning a truth that changed everything? Please like the video. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that survival can turn into healing. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps these stories reach the people who need them most. I told myself part 13 was the ending. The kind of ending you earn after you've run until your lungs burn and your hands shake and your whole life feels like it's been ripped out by the roots. The kind of ending where you finally get to exhale and believe the world might stop punishing you for being brave. And then a week later, the world sent me one more envelope. Not a threat, not a bill. Just the kind of truth that shows up late, like it was stuck in traffic while your life fell apart without it. It arrived on a Tuesday, right after Hazel came home from school with her hair slightly frizzed from the cold and her cheeks pink from laughing too hard in gym class. She had started making friends in the careful way kids do when they've learned that closeness can disappear. She didn't race into other people's arms. She stood near them. She listened. Then she offered pieces of herself like gifts she was learning not to regret. That day, she kicked off her shoes and asked if we could make pancakes for dinner, the way we had in the safe house when everything was terrifying and new. It was strange how rituals worked. The same food could taste like comfort or captivity depending on what your brain decided it meant. I said yes anyway. I learned that sometimes you choose the ritual, even if your nerves want to call it superstition. While Hazel measured flour like she was conducting a science experiment, I noticed the envelope on the counter. Federal return address. My name typed in clean black letters. No warning symbols. No urgent stamps. Just quiet. That quiet always makes my spine tense. I waited until Hazel was in the living room, cross-legged on the rug, flipping through one of Ethan's book lists like it was a treasure map. She had started doing that more lately, like she was searching for him in the margins. I didn't stop her. I didn't tell her to move on. You don't move on from someone like Ethan. You learn to carry them without bleeding. I opened the envelope and found a single page from Agent Holt, written in that practical tone she used when she was trying not to sound human. She explained that one final piece of the case had been declassified enough to share with me. Not public. Not press, just me. It was a summary of a sealed court exhibit related to the Gala attempt. My hands went cold. The Gala had always felt like the beginning, like the moment the universe chose us and dragged us into something bigger than rent and school lunches and exhausted nights. But Agent Holt's summary made it clear that it wasn't the beginning. It was the collision point. The Tanaka cell hadn't chosen that night randomly. They had planned it because a specific donor was attending and because a specific security protocol would be slightly relaxed to accommodate the event's publicity. They had known the kitchen routes, the bottle service, the timing of the orchestra's set changes. They had also known, somehow, that Graham Burke would be there. And then came the part that made my throat close. They did not intend to kill Graham first. They intended to test something first. The exhibit summary described a pattern. Small, controlled poisonings in other cities that mimicked heart conditions, followed by quiet blackmail. It was a method used to turn high-value people into silent assets. The victim lives, panics, believes their body is failing, and becomes pliable. The Gala attempt was supposed to be that kind of operation. A leash, not a gunshot. But at the last minute, their plan changed. Agent Holt's summary said the cell received a directive about an unexpected variable, and the instruction shifted from coercion to elimination. They decided Graham had to die that night, not be controlled, because they believed someone close to him had a key, not a financial key, a linguistic one. Hazel. My stomach dropped so hard I had to brace my hand against the counter. I felt the kitchen tilt like I was back on that ballroom floor, surrounded by chandeliers and fake smiles, watching my child run toward danger because her instincts were clearer than mine. Agent Holt explained, in careful language, that Tanaka's people had intercepted chatter about a child who could read lips in multiple languages, a child who could pick up patterns and codes instantly. The rumor had traveled through the shadow world like a spark in dry grass. They believed Ethan's research files had been built with layers of language locks. They believed Hazel was the lockpick. They believed Graham's orbit was the only place they could get close enough to confirm it. That's why the Gala happened. Not because my daughter was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Because the wrong people had finally learned her name. It was a twist that didn't feel like relief. It felt like a bruise you press by accident, and remember you're still healing. I sat at the table and stared at the page for a long time, thinking about how many decisions had been made without me. How many men in suits had moved chess pieces around while I was counting dollars in my wallet and trying to stretch spaghetti into 2 meals. A part of me wanted to rage. At Ethan. For hiding the truth. At Graham. For living in a world that pulled danger like gravity. At myself. For thinking love and hardship were the biggest things a woman could survive. Then Hazel wandered into the kitchen, drawn by the silence. She always noticed silence. It was one of the ways her gift showed itself. She didn't just hear words. She heard what people avoided. She looked up at me and tilted her head, her eyes sharp and soft at the same time. In my mind, I could almost hear her asking what happened. the way she used to in that safe house, when she saw the world through security monitors and adult tension. But she didn't need the details. She needed the truth I could handle. So I told her, in the simplest way I could, that Agent Holt had confirmed something about the gala. I admitted that the bad people had been paying attention to her gift longer than we realized. I confessed that it made me feel sick, not because Hazel had done anything wrong, but because someone had tried to make her brilliance into a reason to hurt her. Hazel listened without flinching, and then she did something that cracked me open in the gentlest way. She reminded me, with that strange mix of child and old soul, that her gift wasn't what hurt us. The men who wanted power hurt us. The ones who believed children were tools hurt us. Her gift was simply the flashlight. It showed the danger that was already there. I had to blink fast to keep tears from spilling, because she was right. I thought about that ballroom again, about the moment she knocked the glass away. Everyone had stared like she was reckless, like she was a problem. But she wasn't reckless. She was brave. And in a sick way, the exhibit summary gave me something I didn't know I needed. It gave meaning to the chaos. It proved the gala wasn't fate picking on me. It was predators following a trail, and my daughter had broken their plan with nothing but instinct and love. That night, after pancakes and homework and a bath that smelled like lavender, Hazel sat with her book list again. She asked if we could make a new ritual, something that belonged to our new life. I suggested that every Tuesday, we pick one small thing to celebrate. Not a big achievement, not a milestone, just a quiet win, a good grade, a funny moment, a day where we made it home safely and laughed anyway. Hazel loved that idea the way kids love anything that makes the world feel manageable. Later, when she was asleep, I folded Agent Holt's page and tucked it into the same folder as Ethan's letter. I didn't want to live in documents, but I also didn't want to pretend truth didn't matter. I wanted to be the kind of woman who could hold both, grief and gratitude, fear and hope, love and boundaries. And then my phone buzzed with a message routed through the liaison office. It was from Agent Holt, brief and clinical. She noted that Graham's sentencing hearing had been scheduled, and that he had requested, through proper channels, that Hazel's trust paperwork be expedited before the hearing date. No conditions. No ask in return. A small, quiet gesture. The kind of gesture that didn't try to buy my forgiveness. The kind that simply proved he still knew how to keep his word. I stared at the message for a long time. Because that's what dark love looks like when it's trying to become something healthier. Not roses. Not grand speeches. Just the choice to protect. Even when protection costs you something. I don't know what I'll choose if the day comes when I'm allowed to speak to him face to face in a monitored room with cameras in the corners and rules that make romance feel almost impossible. But I do know this. My life is no longer a reaction to other people's secrets. It's mine now. And Hazel's. And maybe, if the world stays quiet long enough, it will someday become ours, in a way that doesn't feel borrowed. If you made it all the way to this bonus ending, tell me what you think. Should Claire keep her distance forever? Or is there a way to build love with boundaries that actually hold? Please like the video, share it with someone who loves emotional stories with real healing, and comment below where you're watching from. I read more comments than you think, and your support keeps this channel alive. I used to think the hardest part of survival was the running, the packing, the hiding, the way your heart learns to sleep with one ear open. But after everything went quiet, I learned the truth. The hardest part is what comes after when nobody is chasing you, and you still flinch at the sound of a car door outside. When you finally have space to breathe, and your mind fills it with echoes. When your child smiles again, and you catch yourself waiting for the moment it gets taken away. That's where part 15 begins. Not with gunfire. Not with sirens. Just with a Tuesday that looked ordinary enough to trick me. It was a little after 4 in the afternoon when I stood outside Hazel's school, watching parents gather near the pickup doors like a flock that had learned how to pretend the world was simple. The air had that early winter bite that makes you pull your coat tighter, even if it isn't that cold yet. I kept my hands in my pockets anyway, not because I was cold, but because I didn't know what to do with them now that I wasn't constantly gripping someone's wrist and pulling them away from danger. Hazel came out with her backpack bouncing and her hair half-tamed, like she'd spent the day being a kid instead of a target. She spotted me immediately, not because I was easy to see, but because she was Hazel. She always saw the important thing first. She walked up beside me and leaned into my side, like she'd decided that was the new tradition. No words, no performance. Just her shoulder against my coat, grounding me. We didn't talk much on the drive home. Hazel didn't fill silence unless she needed to. She let it exist the way other kids let background music exist. I noticed she kept glancing at the sky, tracking clouds the way she used to track men through security monitors. It was the same brain, the same patterns, just in a safer direction. At home, she kicked off her shoes and did that little half-spin toward the kitchen that always meant she had an idea. She grabbed the pancake mix we kept on the top shelf and pulled a stool over like she'd been doing it her whole life. A week ago, she had been living behind reinforced doors. Now she was making dinner. That contrast almost hurt. She measured flour with the seriousness of someone defusing a bomb, her lips moving silently as she counted. She had started counting out loud again sometimes. Not because she needed to, but because she liked the shape of numbers in her mouth. It was one of the ways she made sense of the world. I didn't correct her. I didn't tell her she was too intense. Intensity had saved her. While she worked, I checked the mail out of habit. Most days it was the usual junk flyers, coupons, a letter from the school about a fundraiser I wasn't sure we'd join. But that day there was a plain envelope with a federal return address. My name printed cleanly, like it had been typed by someone who believed all lives fit into filing systems. My stomach tightened. Hazel didn't notice at first. She was humming under her breath, the same few notes over and over, like she was building a tiny wall of sound around herself. I slipped the envelope onto the counter and tried to act like it was nothing. But Hazel always noticed what I tried to hide. She asked, without turning around, if I was okay. The way she said it wasn't childish. It was careful. It was the voice of someone who had learned that adults lie to protect kids, and that those lies feel like abandonment. I told her I was fine, and I hated myself for the softness of that lie. So I did something I had promised myself I would do. In this new life, where we weren't supposed to be running anymore. I opened the envelope. Inside was a single page from Agent Holt. She didn't waste words. She never did. Her writing always sounded like she was trying not to admit she had a heart. She explained that the case materials were being finalized, loose ends closed, evidence moved, and one exhibit sealed and restricted had been approved for a partial disclosure to me because it involved Hazel directly. My hands went numb. Hazel stood still behind me. I didn't have to look to know she'd stopped measuring. Agent Holt's summary described what I thought I already knew. The Gala had been an assassination attempt. Poison. A bottle meant for Graham. A plan disguised as charity and crystal chandeliers. But then the page shifted into something else. It said the Gala was not random. It said the cell hadn't chosen that night because it was convenient. They'd chosen it because it was a test. They had a pattern, controlled poisonings that mimicked natural heart failure, followed by blackmail. They didn't just kill people. They turned them into assets first. It was a way of making powerful men behave without anyone seeing the leash. The plan for Graham was supposed to be that kind of operation. A slow fear, a private panic, a quiet surrender. And then, according to Agent Holt, something changed at the last minute. A directive came through. A new instruction. The operation shifted from control to elimination. Because of an unexpected variable. Because they believed someone close to Graham had a key they couldn't afford to leave alive. Hazel. I felt the kitchen tilt. The air seemed to thin. Like my body suddenly remembered all the oxygen it had used during those weeks of terror. Agent Holt wrote that Tanaka's people had intercepted rumors about a child who could read lips, pick up languages instantly, decode patterns like they were songs. The rumor traveled fast through the underworld, the way truth does when it's useful and cruel. They believed Ethan's files were built with language locks. They believed Hazel was the only one who could unlock them. They believed the Gala was their best chance to confirm it. In other words, that night wasn't fate playing games with us. It was predators following a trail. My throat closed as I remembered Hazel running through the ballroom. The shattered glass, my humiliation, my panic, my instinct to apologize because that's what poor women do when rich people glare at them. And all along, the real reason we were there was because the wrong people had already decided my daughter mattered too much to live. Hazel's hands touched my elbow, light as a question mark. I looked down and saw her face calm, observant, a little too old in her eyes. She didn't ask me to explain the whole thing. She didn't demand details. She asked me what it meant, so I told her the truth in the only way I could. I told her the bad men had been paying attention to her gift longer than we realized. I told her it wasn't her fault. I told her I was angry not at her, but at a world that could look at a child and see a weapon. Hazel listened, and then she did what she always did when the world tried to make her feel like a problem. She reframed it. In her small, steady way, she reminded me that her gift hadn't caused the danger. The danger already existed. Her gift simply exposed it faster, like a flashlight in a dark room. She made it sound so simple I almost broke. Because she was right, and because she shouldn't have had to be. That night, After we ate pancakes for dinner and Hazel did her homework with her tongue poking out in concentration, I tucked her into bed. I stayed longer than usual, sitting on the edge of her mattress while she talked about the book she'd been reading. She told me she liked stories where the scary part happened early, because it meant the rest of the story was about how people changed. I realized that was what she needed now. Not denial, not pretending we were normal, but proof that survival could turn into growth. When she fell asleep, I went back to the kitchen and folded Agent Holt's page. I didn't want to live in documents. I didn't want to be trapped inside evidence bags and case files forever. But I also refused to pretend that truth didn't matter just because it hurt. I pulled out the folder where I kept Ethan's letter, the one I'd read so many times it felt like my fingertips had memorized it. I slid Holt's page behind it like it belonged there, like Ethan's truth and Holt's truth were part of the same story. Because they were. And then my phone buzzed. A message from the liaison office. Holt again. Short. Clinical. But the words still landed like a weight. Graham's hearing date had been scheduled. And in the same breath, Holt noted that Graham had requested Hazel's trust paperwork be finalized before the hearing. No conditions. No public credit. No attempt to speak to me directly. Just action. A quiet follow-through. The kind of thing that doesn't ask for forgiveness. The kind of thing that only proves someone is still trying to keep their word even when the world is watching and judging. I stared at the message for a long time, feeling two truths battle in my chest. One truth was simple. Graham lived in a world that had almost swallowed us. The other truth was just as real. He had been the one person in that world who never treated Hazel like a commodity. He had treated her like a person even when her gift could have been useful to him. In the past, that kind of contradiction would have tempted me into an all-or-nothing decision. Love or hate, trust or fear, stay or run. But I wasn't that woman anymore. I had learned that life is made of boundaries, not fantasies. And I had learned that sometimes the bravest thing a mother can do is admit that love can exist without surrender. So I did what felt like the safest version of hope. I asked Holt, through proper channels, if it was possible to begin a supervised letter exchange. Not a meeting, not a promise. Just words on paper that could be reviewed, monitored, controlled. A way for Graham to speak without reaching into my life. A way for me to respond without being pulled into his gravity. A way for Hazel, someday, to read the truth about the man she saved and decide what it meant to her, instead of inheriting my fear. When I hit send, my hands didn't shake. That was how I knew it was the right choice. Because it wasn't desperation. It wasn't loneliness. It wasn't me craving danger because peace felt unfamiliar. It was me, finally, choosing with my eyes open. The next Tuesday, Hazel and I started our new ritual. We called it the Small Wins Jar. Every Tuesday, we wrote one small win on a slip of paper. Hazel wrote that she answered a question in class without feeling her face burn. I wrote that I didn't jump when someone knocked on the door. We folded the slips and dropped them into the jar like we were filling it with proof. Proof that life wasn't just something that happened to us. Proof that we were building it. And in the quiet of our kitchen, with flour dust on the counter and the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence, I realized something that made my chest ache in a way that wasn't fear. Ethan had once built secrets like walls, thinking he was protecting us. But real protection wasn't secrecy. Real protection was giving Hazel a mother who could stand in the truth and still choose tenderness. It was giving her a life where she didn't have to earn safety by being extraordinary, where she could just be a kid who liked pancakes and books and clouds. I don't know what the future looks like. I don't know what will happen with Graham's sentence, or whether time will soften the sharpest parts of what we survived. But I do know what I want now. I want a life where love isn't a cage, where boundaries aren't punishments, they're promises, where my daughter can grow up knowing that being brave doesn't mean being reckless. And if you've been through something hard, if you've ever loved someone complicated, or if you've ever had to choose between staying guarded and staying open, tell me what you think. Should Claire keep her distance forever? Or can love with boundaries become something real? If this story hit you in the heart, please like the video, share it with someone who loves emotional stories with healing and hope, and comment below where you're watching from. Your support keeps this channel going, and I read more comments than you think.